Good morning. My name is Curtis Johnson, and I'm the Boulder County Sheriff. Thank you for being here today to learn the outcome of our investigation into the cause and manner of the 2021 Marshall Fire. With me today are the District Attorney for our 20th Judicial District, Michael Doherty, and Senior Deputy District Attorney Ryan Day, as well Detective Commander Jason Olkers from the Boulder County Sheriff's Office, two investigators from the United States Forest Service, Special Agents Travis Lunders and Aaron Henricks, who assisted in our investigation, and Paul Way, who works for the consulting firm Jensen Hughes. We hired that firm to help us with our investigation. He's an electrical engineer and a wildfire expert. These experts are not lined up to speak to the media today, but they're here to help us answer questions should we need them. And I'd like to thank them for their significant contributions to our investigation. The Sheriff's Office has received a tremendous amount of community support, both during, after, and continuing with the fire investigation. Part of that strong support was from our three county commissioners who are with us today, Claire Levy, Ashley Stolzman, and Marta Loachman. And also joining us is Mark Lasis, the mayor of the town of Superior. I'd like to take a quick moment and remind you of the conditions in December of 2021 when the Marshall Fire started. In the spring of 2021, we had significant precipitation, which helped vegetation throughout the county grow thick and healthy and strong. But that was followed by months of hot, dry conditions. And all of that vegetation, including tall grasses, shrubs, and trees, were extremely dry by December. There were fire restrictions in place on December 30th because the National Weather Service had issued a high wind warning for Boulder County. That high wind warning automatically triggers fire restrictions. We then experienced sustained winds of 50 to 60 miles per hour, frequent gusts between 80 and 100 miles per hour, and the highest wind gust recorded that day was 115 miles an hour. Early in the morning, there were other small fires sparked in our community, one on North Broadway in the city of Boulder, and a second larger fire known as the Middle Fork Fire in unincorporated Boulder County. As the winds began to pick up that morning, shortly after 11 a.m., we were alerted to a new fire near the intersection of Highway 93 and Eldorado Springs Drive. That fire became known as the Marshall Fire. It swept through subdivisions and commercial buildings in the communities of unincorporated Boulder County, the city of Louisville, and the town of Superior. It even managed to cross a 6-lane highway at US 36. The fire continued to spread quickly and eventually grew to become 6,080 acres in size. An estimated 35,000 people were evacuated from their homes and businesses that day. The fire destroyed over 1,000 residential structures and damaged many more. It also destroyed and damaged several commercial properties in our community. Other homes experienced severe smoke damage, and some were damaged solely by the high wind event that day. The Marshall Fire became the most destructive fire in state history, with over $2 billion in losses. The fire tragically took the lives of two of our community members, Robert Sharp, who was 69, and Edna Nadine Turnbull, who was 91. And although we don't know the exact number of pets and animals lost that day, some estimates have it being nearly 1,000. With every home that burned that day, people lost everything. All their possessions, family heirlooms were turned to ash. I share in that loss as I lost my home to the Marshall Fire. And if you'll give me a little grace, I get a little emotional still about the impact that has had on my family. I recognize that the investigation into the cause and the origin of the Marshall Fire has taken a significant amount of time to complete. Our investigative team cumulatively worked thousands of hours on the investigation. In addition, we consulted with outside labs, subject matter experts, fire investigators with the Forest Service, and our electrical engineer and wildfire expert. That investigation included initially looking into 146 reports of missing people in the hours and days following the fire, conducting 2 thorough death investigations, collecting nearly 200 items of evidence, reviewing nearly 200 tips from the community, writing and executing multiple search warrants, reviewing hundreds of videos and photos from that day, interviewing hundreds of victims and witnesses, and reviewing every 911 call that was made that day. Throughout this, the Sheriff's Office was committed to conducting a thorough investigation. And while it took time, I can confidently say that we know what happened and why. Later today, all of the investigative reports will be shared with the media and the community on our website. It is important to me and District Attorney Doherty that we openly share the results of this investigation. The Marshall Fire is actually comprised of 2 fires. The first started on a residential property at 5325 Eldorado Springs Drive, shortly after 11 a.m. At that location, 6 days before the Marshall Fire, on December 24th, a fire was conducted by the residents on that property to dispose of scrap wood and tree branches. The fire drew the attention of a passerby who called the Boulder County Communications Center and reported it to us. Firefighters from the Mountain View Fire Protection District, along with the sheriff's deputy, responded. The weather conditions on December 24th were cool and damp with no significant winds. When the firefighters arrived and met with the residents, it was determined that they intended to let the fire burn out and then bury it. Given the weather on that day, the fact that there was a large water source on the property, which can actually be seen on this 3rd photograph to my left, on the far left side, you can see an above-ground pool that at the time was filled with water. It's now iced over due to these photos being taken shortly after the fire. This first photograph is the fire that day. And the second photograph shows a map. On top is 5325 Eldorado Springs Drive, that top red dot. Given that there was the large water source on the property and the plan to cover the coals with dirt, the fire department believed the fire was being conducted responsibly. The remnants of the fire were covered with dirt at about 5 p.m. by the residents, and there was no indication between December 24th and December 30th of any additional fire after the coals and ashes had been buried. On December 30th, the high wind event uncovered the previously buried fire, and the embers were exposed to oxygen and blown into the nearby dry vegetation. The vegetation caught fire and began to quickly spread through the property. Our investigators consulted with the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory and learned that under the right conditions, smoldering combustion can occur for weeks or even months when buried. The residents of that property were initially unaware of the fire that began. And once they realized there was fire and that it was spreading, they attempted to put it out. But the winds were quickly spreading the flames faster than they could keep up. The first responding firefighters reported that the shed on the property, which was widely publicized in social media and in the media, was not burning when they first arrived. It did soon burn as the fire continued to spread east on the property. That shed was initially investigated as a potential location for where the fire started. But after our investigators exhumed and recreated the remains of the shed, we learned that there was no electrical service to the shed and no indication that the fire started at that location. Firefighters then reported that the fire began to make a run to the east towards the Marshall community. And despite their efforts to reposition and try to stop the fire, the winds overwhelmed them. Approximately 1 hour later, a second fire started just south of the Marshall Mesa trailhead. And you can see that on the second photograph to my left. The bottom red dot at this corner shows where that Marshall Mesa trailhead start point was. Initially, our investigators looked into the possibility that the second fire may have been caused by embers from the first fire. Given the fact that the second fire was approximately 2,000 feet south and west of the first fire, investigators quickly determined that it was not likely that embers moved that far against the wind and started the second fire. And again, that second photograph, you can see the two red dots are the two locations where fire started, and that gives you a relative distance between them, and the fact that that second start at the bottom was west of, and the prevailing winds that day were blowing from the west to the east at 50 plus miles per hour. Further investigation determined that the most likely cause of the second fire was hot particles discharged from an Xcel Energy power line. A close examination of the power lines in the area revealed that one of the power lines had become unmoored from a crossarm and was hanging low enough to come into contact with a support brace. The sheriff's office then retained an electrical engineer and wildfire expert to assist with the investigation of the power lines, and he determined that the power line showed significant evidence of electrical arcing. The arcing of the power lines produced hot aluminum particles, which were then discharged into the receptive fuels below the power line. Our expert stated in his findings that it is more likely than not that discharge particles from the power lines started the second fire. These two photographs to my right show an image from a trail camera that was placed at the Marshall Mesa trailhead. And in it, it's hard to discern, but you can see the unmoored power line hanging and where the fire started. The second photograph is a close-up of one of the power lines involved, and you can see visibly that there is material missing from the line. This unmoored power line was not recognized by investigators during the initial inspection of the area. That is because the power line had been reattached to the crossarm in an effort to restore power to the area as quickly as possible. You may recall that the day after the Marshall fire, temperatures fell and we began to receive snow. There were thousands of homes in the area without power and legitimate concerns that the freezing weather would cause additional damage to homes from freezing pipes. There were urgent requests for Xcel Energy to restore power in the area as quickly as possible, and the previously unmoored power line had to be repaired as part of that power restoration project. There were also reports of a downed power line in the area of Highway 93 and El Dorado Springs Drive. The only downed line, or line that was in contact with the ground, was located and determined to be a communication line. Inspection of that line found that there was not sufficient electrical current in the line to have started a fire. The coal seams in the area of the Marshall Mesa Trailhead were also investigated as a potential cause of the Marshall Fire. The Marshall area is well known as a site of several old coal mines dating all the way back to the 1800s. Coal mine fires occur underground, and as the coal burns, land shifts and vents or surface vents are created, or seams in the earth. There are coal seams in the area of the Marshall Mesa Trailhead. And in 2005, there was a small grass fire which was determined to have been started by a surface vent from an underground coal fire. A significant amount of remediation was done in that area after 2005 in an effort to prevent that from happening again. Investigators developed no evidence of elevated underground fire activity that could have produced surface temperatures capable of starting the second fire. While the power line is the most probable cause of the second fire, the underground coal mine fires cannot be completely ruled out. We also know that the two fires became one at some point, but there is no way for us to precisely determine exactly when or where this occurred. For the purposes of our investigation, it is not relevant, as we were focused on where and how the fire started. The Sheriff's Office and the District Attorney's Office worked very closely during this investigation. And when all of the facts had been gathered, we asked the District Attorney's Office to review the results. I'm now going to invite our District Attorney, Michael Doherty, to come up and talk about his review of the case.
Good morning, and thank you for being here today. My name is Michael Doherty, and I have the honor of being the District Attorney for the 20th Judicial District, which is Boulder County. And I want to start by thanking Sheriff Johnson for that very thorough presentation. I'm going to seek to not repeat everything he has said, but I'm going to touch on some of the things that we worked on in conjunction with the Sheriff's Office. We did, as the Sheriff noted, have a very close working relationship with the Sheriff's Office throughout this entire investigation. That started when Joe Pelly was our sheriff and continued under the leadership and direction of Sheriff Johnson. I will just share with you that on the day and night of the fire, when I responded to the Emergency Command Center, and I could see in the distance the fire spreading incredibly quickly and different plumes of flames jumping, and I realized and was told those were different houses going up throughout the community. Standing next to me was Sheriff Johnson, and his house was one of those over 1,100 homes that were devastated on December 30th of that year. For Sheriff Johnson and his family, and for all the community members who were impacted, our commitment from the very beginning was to conduct and assist and then review an exhaustive investigation and to leave no stone unturned. That was our commitment since day one, recognizing how many people had their lives devastated, how many homes were destroyed, how many pets were killed, and then also the two victims who tragically lost their lives, Edna Turnbull and Robert Sharp. We also had members of the District Attorney's Office who were directly impacted by the fire. So from the very beginning, our commitment was to leave no stone unturned in conducting an incredibly thorough, exhaustive investigation, and then to share the results of that investigation with our community members. So from the beginning, we were working as a second pair of eyes along with the Sheriff's Office with assistance from the United States Forest Service, the Department of Mining and Reclamation Services, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, outside experts, electrical engineers, other law enforcement agencies. We also were committed to being transparent. So as the sheriff noted, but it bears repeating, this presentation is being recorded and it's going to be put on the sheriff's website, available for everybody in the community to watch. We also have put together a summary report that captures the findings of the sheriff's office, the district attorney's office, the U.S. Forest Service, and the experts that we utilized during the course of this investigation. That summary report will be provided to you today and to the community today as well. In addition, all the body-worn camera video that has not yet been released will be released by the sheriff's office. The experts' reports will be available on the sheriff's website. The police reports will be available on the sheriff's website. So I would invite and encourage community members and, of course, members of the media to look through those materials, to take a look at everything we looked at, everything the investigators worked to gather, and everything that leads us to our conclusions that we share with you today. The district attorney's office assisted in the investigation and review of this case. We went through all the evidence, documents, and materials in conjunction with the investigation by the sheriff's office and other agencies. The district attorney's office joins in the conclusions that the sheriff's office investigators reached in this case. And those are shared in the summary report that Sheriff Johnson and I put together with help from our staff. Additionally, the district attorney's office looked to see if it would be possible or justified to charge any criminal offenses in connection with the cause and origin of the Marshall Fire. The decision of the district attorney's office, which is that there's insufficient or no evidence of a crime having been committed, is consistent with the findings by the sheriff's office investigators, the U.S. Forest Service, and also the experts who worked on this case. I will say that the law and ethical rules for prosecutors require us to only file charges when there's evidence of a crime, and when that evidence can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. The decision we reached today is based on input from the experts, the investigators, but also going through the case with different investigators and different prosecutors unconnected to the investigation, getting their feedback, their direction, their questions to continue driving the investigation forward and ensuring that we make the right decision for our community today. I will say the criminal standard for proving criminal offenses is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That is, of course, as you know, higher than what's required in civil law and civil practice. So in criminal law, we have a much higher standard of proving cases beyond a reasonable doubt. It's the highest standard in a court of law and the highest standard in the country, of course. This fire was terribly destructive and traumatic for so many people. We make our decisions about charging criminal offenses based on evidence and not based on emotion. So we've gone through all of the evidence in the case. And what I want to just really stress for the community is if we were to tell you today that we were filing charges, it would be wrong and unethical. We can only file charges when there's evidence of a crime having been committed. And I'm going to go through each one of these things and talk to you about where we have insufficient evidence, or for a couple things, actually no evidence that a crime was committed based on the exhaustive investigation that was conducted here. And if we were to tell you that we were filing charges today, I imagine some people would cheer that decision because of how much people have suffered in this community. That cheering would come to an abrupt stop in about 6 weeks because we'd have our first court hearing where we have to show a judge that we have evidence to move forward with a criminal prosecution, and a judge would dismiss this prosecution for a lack of any evidence. Also, doing that would violate the ethical rules and the law for prosecutors and my sworn responsibility to this community to always seek to do the right thing based on the evidence that we have available to us. So I'm going to go through the analysis and where we have insufficient, or for a couple of things I'll cover, no evidence that a crime was committed. Obviously, if additional information comes to light through the civil litigation that will certainly be taking place and that's already underway, and the sheriff's office and the district attorney's office would review it and reconsider it. We've had an exhaustive criminal investigation, and I want to highlight that while what we're sharing today will certainly be of relevance and interest and perhaps value in civil litigation, we are focused on the criminal investigation and whether there was sufficient evidence for criminal charges. So first, with regards to 5325 El Dorado, which is represented by that red dot at the top of the photo, 2 to my left. I'll step over and show it to you. Sorry. There was physical examination, drones utilized, thermal imaging, a burn pattern analysis, and through all of that, the investigators and experts determined the fire originated from the remnants of the December 24th fire, which is depicted in this first photograph here to my left. We have, as you likely know if you live in Boulder County or another community like Boulder, but if you live in a metro region, you may not be aware of this. In more rural communities, we have hundreds of fires set by property owners every year. And that's in Boulder County alone when I say hundreds. So hundreds of fires are set by property owners every year. Obviously, it has to be in certain conditions, and I'll talk about that as we go through this. But the United States Forest Service concluded that the extraordinarily high winds that we faced on December 30th uncovered the buried fire from December 24th that had been set by the residents of 5325 El Dorado. The wind then blew those embers across the property and caught fire. In reaching that conclusion, the United States Forest Service, as the sheriff mentioned, also worked with the United States Department of Agriculture and the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory. And we learned that fire that is buried by dirt, that has smoldering embers, can go for hours, days, weeks, and in some conditions, even months. And in the materials we'll be sharing through the sheriff's website today, you'll see that in the experts' reports, and you'll also see the research that they looked at in reaching those conclusions. So all that information will be provided to you. As the sheriff mentioned, but I want to highlight the video of the shed that was on fire on December 30th, which went viral. That shed was not on fire when first responders arrived on scene there. The excavation of the shed discovered that there was no electrical wiring or nothing within the shed itself that could have caused the fire or caught fire. It was clear that that was not on fire on December 30th when people first arrived at the property and residents and firefighters were working to try to put out the flames. There is no evidence that the residents of 5325 El Dorado set a fire on December 30th. There's no evidence of that. I say that based on all the work that was done, but also there were approximately 40 people living in the structures at 5325 El Dorado at the time of the December 30th fire. Sheriff's Office investigators and district attorney investigators interviewed all of the adults who were on the property at the time of the fire. There were also children there, and we utilized specially trained forensic child examiners to interview all the children who were on the property at that time to determine, did anybody start a fire on December 30th? And through all of the analysis and the interviews, we were able to determine that the fire was set on December 24th and that no one saw any smoke, flames, or indication of any fire whatsoever between December 24th and December 30th. To say that the investigators conducted a very thorough search of the property and of all the conduct that had happened in that week leading up to the fire would be fair. An incredibly thorough investigation was conducted, including a search of the entire property. So when we talk about criminal charges, when we look at a charge of arson, for example, there are two things I'll share with you that are elements for being able to prove a charge of arson. One is knowingly, which means someone knows or is practically certain that a result is going to come as a result of their conduct. If they know that what they're about to do is going to cause a certain result. Or recklessly. And under criminal law, not civil, but under criminal law, recklessly is defined as disregarding a substantial or unjustifiable risk. There's no evidence to indicate that when they set the fire on December 24th, that they had any knowledge that after covering it with dirt, that the embers would be uncovered by the wind, spark, and cause a fire on December 30th. In addition, there's no indication that they disregarded the substantial and unjustifiable risk when they started this fire on December 24th. I would highlight for you, as the sheriff mentioned, that on December 24th, it was wet, rainy, and cool out. Also, it's important to note what the sheriff touched on, that the firefighters from Mountain View Fire responded on December 24th after a community member called in about the fire having been set on the property at 5325. The firefighters, a Boulder County Sheriff's deputy, and someone from Boulder County Open Space and Mountain Park Rangers all responded. They determined, Mountain View Fire did, that the fire, the way it had been set and their plan to extinguish it was reasonable and responsible. There's no way we could prove in court today that their conduct on December 24th was criminally reckless when the firefighters who were there determined that their conduct in setting the fire and their plan to extinguish the fire was in fact reasonable and responsible. And this is one of hundreds of fires that are used in Boulder County by property owners every year. The fire was then smoldering for 6 days and no sign of it until December 30th. I will say, just to give you an example of how you might want to look at this, if we take a step back from the fire for a minute, let's say you have a frozen lake and hundreds of people go on the lake without a problem. It's frozen solid. There's no signs prohibiting people from going on the lake. And on this particular day, a man takes a couple kids out onto the ice, and first responders come along and say the lake is frozen solid, you have nothing to worry about. And at some point thereafter, one of the kids goes through the ice. Is the man responsible? On some level, of course. But was he criminally reckless? No. So we look at the evidence and the law to determine what the right decision is here. Clearly on December 24th, when they set this fire, they had no idea that the high wind event, where winds were gusting up to 100 miles per hour, were going to happen on December 30th. They had no idea that this could spread and destroy over 1,000 homes. They did take, as the sheriff noted, and I think it's worth repeating for members of our community, they did take immediate action upon realizing that it was on fire to try to put the fire out. First responders did the same, and the fire quickly got away from everybody. I'll turn now to the Marshall Mesa Trailhead fire. I'm just going to step by you for 1 second. That's represented by the second red dot there, and as the sheriff indicated, it's more likely than not that that fire was caused by electrical equipment and wiring maintained by Xcel. It is possible that other causes of that fire are responsible. So it's possible, certainly, that embers could have gone from that top red dot down to the red dot you see at the bottom there. That's very unlikely, and very unlikely. I mean, it would have had to travel 2,000 feet going against a wind that was blowing at an incredibly high rate from west to east. And if you look at the two red dots and where they're lined up there, you can see that the second red dot is to the west, so in the opposite direction of where the wind was blowing. Obviously, wind changes directions at times, but it's extremely unlikely that any embers went from that first fire down to and caused the second fire. I will highlight, and something I'm going to come back to in a little while, is the location of the coal seam vents, because I think that's really important for people to be aware of. Can I step by you for 1 second? Sorry. I was told not to move away from the microphone while speaking, so. You can see this when you come up here after, and you'll also be able to see it on the sheriff's website, but I want to highlight for you First fire is happening up here. Down here is the electrical pole maintained by Excel. There were two specific areas represented by lines to these red boxes called specific area of origin, where investigators and experts believe fire may have started in this grassy area. There are green boxes, and I'm going to point to them, and I recognize you're at a distance now, but green box here, 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 and here. These are all coal seam vents in that exact same area. For the reasons the sheriff noted already and that I'll cover in a moment, we do not believe that the coal seam vent is responsible for the fire, but I want to highlight for you that these are all in the exact same area of what we're talking about here. Also, I want to highlight through this photograph that the specific origin area here and here, these two areas, one is 79.6 feet from the pole, and the other is 110.5 feet from the pole. So 79.6 and 110.5 from the pole in question. Seems more probable and more likely that it was the Excel wire as opposed to embers from 2,000 feet away or the coal seam vents that caused the fire. I recognize that Excel may not share that view. But the evidence we have and the input from the experts and the investigators and all the work that has gone into it led us to conclude that it's more likely that that second fire was started due to an Excel wire that had become unmoored from the pole. The question for criminal charges, though, is whether Excel was criminally reckless or negligent in their maintenance of that wire. So we looked at a number of things, and I will say that neither the investigators nor the experts found any evidence of criminally negligent or reckless system design or maintenance in connection with the equipment and wiring in that specific area. It appears that the extraordinarily high winds on December 30th caused the power line to disconnect and then contact other lines, and you see that in the photo there, the damage that was being caused, which caused arcing and hot particles to be then released into a bed of receptive fuel, as it's called, the grass that we had there. There was no evidence of worn materials, shoddy construction, or substandard conditions. Thus, no criminal charges could be proven against Excel Energy for the role that it likely played, or their equipment likely played, in that second fire igniting at the trailhead there. From the expert's report, I would just read to you, no design, installation, or maintenance defects or deficiencies in that area. The poles, conductors, and insulators in that specific area were in good condition. So that's something we looked at very closely to determine whether there's any criminally reckless or criminally negligent conduct. So I'm going to touch on the decision about, or investigation into, the repair of the wires immediately following the fire. I will emphasize what the sheriff said, and I think it's an important point. The snow was coming down. It was freezing cold. People were without power. Pipes were freezing. There was concern that people were going to be driven out of the homes that were still standing. And there was demands that the power be turned on. In fact, some of law enforcement had engaged with Excel to urge them and their massive response to this fire event to get the power back on as quickly as they could. So after the investigation, there's no evidence at all that they repaired the line in an effort to impede the investigation or hide something from criminal or civil proceedings. However, as the sheriff noted, when the investigators had initially responded, the wire that you could see disconnected here was no longer disconnected. Leaving no stone unturned, even though there was no indication that they had taken the step to repair the wire in an effort to hide anything from investigators, we wanted to confirm that. So we conducted an investigation into that aspect as well. And we were focused on where Excel had issued a do not repair order to some of their employees. It was nearby there or arguably in there. It's close by. And we interviewed the employees from Excel and went through all the documents relevant to the repair, and there was no evidence whatsoever from any of those interviews or any of the documents that they repaired the wire to hide anything from investigators. Rather, it seemed entirely consistent with what law enforcement and community leaders have been asking Excel to do, which was please get the power back on as quickly as possible. I'm going to turn now to the initial media reports and information shared on social media regarding Excel's wires, because that's something we actually looked at as part of this investigation as well. The initial media reports indicated that downed power lines were responsible for the fire. As the sheriff has already shared with you, it was determined that it was a communications wire that was actually down, and we confirmed through the investigation and through the use of experts that the communications line could not cause a fire, given the amount of energy that travels through the communication line. However, we did focus on an update that was sent out by the Boulder Office of Emergency Management, which read, update on cause of fire. Initial reports were of downed power lines. Xcel Energy Co., this is on Twitter, has been a very responsive and invaluable partner, and after inspection found no downed power lines in the ignition area. That's true. There was a line that was floating and unmoored. The definition of a down line is that it's touching the ground. That's the definition that Excel uses for a down line, means it's touching the ground. However, we wanted to, again, leave no stone unturned and make sure that that was not a miscommunication that was designed to mislead investigators at all. Speaking candidly, I will just say the communication could have been more clear on all sides of that. I'm just telling you my honest take on it. However, based on the review of the Excel documents and interviews, there's no indication that there was an effort there to mislead investigators. The down power line is language they've continued to use since then. They've talked to members of the media about there being no down power lines. That, based on Excel terminology, is technically true. An unmoored line for Excel is considered a floater or a floating line. So when their Excel personnel say down line, they mean something touching the ground. Underground coal fires, I think the sheriff covered it in detail. The only thing I would add to what the sheriff has said is after the 2005 fire that was caused by the coal vent, there were significant steps to mitigate that ever happening again. They dumped 275 tons of material into that area to cover up the underground coal mines. And they've continued to monitor it since, so rather than looking at any possibility they've been criminally negligent or reckless, in fact, they've taken steps to actively mitigate and monitor that site. The only other thing I would add to what the sheriff covered about the underground coal seam is that we also asked, after other high wind events since the Marshall Fire, for the temperature readings from the coal seam vents. So going back to 2005, for example, the temperature reading at the time of that fire was 373 degrees. After the mitigation, the temperatures were always below 90 degrees coming out of the coal seam vent. After the Marshall Fire, as part of this investigation, using thermocouples to monitor the temperature there, we asked, as part of the investigation, please let us know the temperature coming out of the vents after windy days. Of course, we cannot and could not replicate the wind that this community suffered from on December 30th, but on high wind days, there was no indication that there was ever enough temperature coming out of those coal seams as a result of the mitigation to cause a fire. The experts cannot rule it out conclusively, but those are some of the investigative steps we took in determining whether the coal seam was a likely cause of this fire or not. I'm going to turn it back to the sheriff in just a moment. I will say I'll say this. This community has suffered a lot. Our goal here today is to tell you everything that we know and determined about the cause and origin of the Marshall fires. This information is going to be available to all of the community members. I'd be remiss if I didn't point to the strength and resiliency of this great community. And having been in the emergency call center and the disaster assistance center, along with members of our office and other community leaders and volunteers from throughout the community, one thing that really will always stay with me is the incredible response by our community and by this state to support those impacted. That does not end today. Their wounds do not heal today, and likely never will. But as people continue to rebuild, we rebuild as a community. One thing that a gentleman from FEMA told me at the Disaster Assistance Center was that he's never seen a community get a disaster assistance center set up as quickly as Boulder County. And his life, his job is traveling from disaster to disaster. And he's never seen a community respond with the resources, strength, and collective spirit that Boulder County did. When I think of this tragedy and all the lives devastated by it, I will always remember what he said about our response. I share that with you as a resident and as a person and as your district attorney. I'm going to turn it back over to the sheriff, though, to say a couple more things, and then we're happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you again for being here today.
Before we move on, I'd like to just take a moment to thank all of the people who responded to the Marshall Fire, including the first responders from dozens of agencies across the state who showed up, provided assistance, and did everything they could to keep our community safe on December 30th. It's a testament to their bravery that more lives were not lost on that day. I want to thank our investigative team, subject matter experts who helped us. This was a complex investigation, and we appreciate your help and support. I want to thank the District Attorney's Office for working side by side with us and ultimately coming to the same conclusions we did about the cause and origin of the fire and the appropriateness of criminal charging. I really want to thank our Boulder County community. This investigation took longer than was anticipated, and I appreciate your patience. I know personally the last 18 months have been hard, and not having answers creates stress and challenges that we don't need. And I hope that now we can focus on rebuilding our lives and getting back to our homes and our community. We're going to hand out copies of the investigative summary to you now, a hard copy to share with you. And after that's been distributed and I get a drink of water, we'll take questions. Just a little belt. Questions?
Sheriff Pablo, Fox 31. While we know that Excel didn't engage in criminal conduct, is there any reason to believe that better maintenance of the equipment could have prevented the second fire?
I believe our expert indicates in his report that there were no issues with maintenance or upkeep of the lines.
So you're saying
So-
it's strictly a high wind event that nothing could have prevented that?
I think so.
Sheriff Tony Kowalski, Denver 7. Question for both of you. You talked about the wind, the impact, and this one line. Help the community understand why it was just this one line. If everything was okay with the wire, with that, why were there not more lines that had the same impact? Because the wind obviously was not just centered on that one spot.
I don't think we have a definitive answer for you. We're not electrical engineers or lines people. We don't build and maintain power lines. And why that one became unmoored on that day, I don't know.
Is it fair to have that question, to ask that question?
Well, I think that's a great question for XL Energy.
Sheriff Noel Phillips from the Denver Post. It seems like that might have been a needle in a haystack, to like notice that wire had already been rehung. Like when did you like figure out, like what was the path to get to this particular power line and the hunt for that?
Well, it started with further investigation. This trail camera is owned by the sheriff's office, and once we pulled the data from it and were able to review it and look at the evidence of fire, that line hanging low was noticed, and that led to further investigation of that area.
How many months in was that, or was it pretty quick?
It was within a week or two that we were pulling that data.
Brad, on the 9 News, would you guys still recommend people putting out fires like that fire the way that they did?
So I'm not an active camper or fire builder, but I'll tell you, I was always taught to put out fires with water and then bury them, and to check to make sure that the coals are not warm to the touch before you believe that fire is fully extinguished.
I have one thing.
Yes.
I appreciate that question. I will say at the time the fire was set on December 24th, it was not in violation of any state law or county regulation. Boulder County now does, on their website, say that fire should be extinguished not only with the covering of dirt, but also with the use of water. But when fire responded on December 24th, they did not determine or believe there were any violations being committed with this December 24th fire.
Kevin Vaughn, 9 News, can either of you address when Excel was aware of the problem with this particular wire? As recently as yesterday, they told us that they had no indications their equipment played any role in this.
Let me answer the first part of your question. So Excel has had to provide thousands and thousands of pages of documents to us. So of course, they've been aware of this investigation and then our focus on that power line. And they've provided all that documentation. They've had a number of employees, and I can get the number for you, but a number of employees who we requested interviews of, and then they'd submitted to voluntary interviews with sheriff's investigators and members of the DA's office in conjunction with what we covered earlier. Excel may maintain that their wiring did not cause that second fire, and that's a question you can ask Excel. One of the things we looked at, and you'll see this in the reports as well, but I'll share it now so you're aware, is that part of the information that we requested from Excel was with regards to what's called their closer and recloser, which tracks the amount of energy traveling and any disruption in the wires. So what we know, just taking a step back for a moment, what we know from the trail camera, which is only activated at a time of movement. So again, it's not just constantly recording. It's activated at a time that something moves across it. We know that between 10:35 and 11:10 a.m., that wire became unmoored and was floating, banging against other materials there on that pole. From the closer and recloser data from Excel, we know that there was some activity at 12:07 in that area that triggered information that we were able to obtain from Excel Energy. At approximately 12:20 p.m., 13 minutes later, we have smoke coming out from that second fire location. So it doesn't line up exactly. And you'll see in the reports the experts' view of that and the sensitivity of the data collection that they have. But that's the information that we had, and that's the information we got from Excel. So to answer your question, Excel's been fully aware of the investigation and obviously providing materials to us pursuant to request and court orders, and then voluntary interviews with their employees as well.
Just a quick follow-up, I'm assuming that the repair person that went up and reattached that line would have seen what we're seeing in that photograph there on December 31st, no?
So we interviewed, yes, the people who were responsible for repairing this line. That's correct. Yes.
Michael Tony Kowalski again from Denver 7. Recognizing you looked at the criminal investigation, but you've also seen the entire investigation and you have tremendous legal experience. Is there enough evidence in what you've uncovered where Excel needs to be civilly concerned about these findings?
So I've been a prosecutor for 26 years, And we were focused on the criminal investigation here, making sure we reached the right result for the community and then being able to share this information out. To answer your question very directly, I think the information we've shared today and the conclusions we reached will certainly play a role in civil litigation, but I leave that to the civil litigants and the civil attorneys to give you their take on, Tony.
Jesse with the Associated Press. Were the residents at that property part of the 12 Tribes group? Do you know?
Yes.
As a quick follow-up to a previous question, you said that the firefighters who arrived on December 24th for that fire were satisfied with how they were going to put out the fire. You now know that bearing is it can stay alive for months sometimes. Does this at least change recommendations about how people put out fires?
Yes, so that, as the district attorney alluded to, county ordinances were changed last year to provide far more specific information on the proper way to extinguish a fire.
Just to build on that, Joe Wertz, Colorado Public Radio, does that change anything as far as like law enforcement or fire protocol when responding to these things to make sure that these types of fires are extinguished?
That's our intent. Certainly, because we get hundreds of fires that are conducted appropriately on private property throughout our community every year, we do want to look at how we are enforcing those ordinances and making sure that we don't have an incident like this happen again.
Sheriff, I'm sorry about your home, and I hear the emotion in your voice. How do you feel with this outcome, with the no criminal charges yourself?
Well, I can only speak on behalf of where I'm at in relation to the fire. And personally, my wife and I have moved forward. We are rebuilding our home. We are focused on the future. And knowing and having been exposed to all the elements and all the things that were happening that day and watching that fire progress across our county, I know that ultimately sometimes really bad things happen. And I was caught up in that and my home was lost. But I'm moving forward because for me, it's very important to kind of reclaim my life after the fire. And the only way that I feel that I can do that is to rebuild my home, plant my flag, and get back in my neighborhood.
Sheriff, as homeowners are trying to understand this, did your investigation, was it able to conclude that ignition point one caused damage, destruction to these homes, ignition point two destroyed these homes? Were you able to be that conclusive? You talked about they merged, but can homeowners take away, I know which ignition point caused my damage?
Not from this investigation. Our focus was purely on where and how the fire started. What happened to it as it blew east, I can't tell you. In the back, you had your hand up.
Yeah, Tim Grubin, Boulder Reporting Lab. I was wondering if in investigations with Excel, there have been conversations about underground lines moving forward, and if there's going to maybe be a collaboration to push that process forward.
So that's not a part of our investigation. I'm sure there may be discussion in the future amongst other elected leaders in our community. But for the sheriff's office and for the point of this investigation, again, we were focused on what happened and why. Recommendations for future improvements or how power lines should be managed in our community is a bit out of my lane as the sheriff.
Nikki Andrews, Daily Camera. I was just wondering if you had any record of when the two fires merged.
We don't. As I stated earlier, we don't know when or exactly where those fires met. And again, that wasn't the focus of our investigation. We just wanted to know where they started.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Thank you for that question, Nikki. I just want to emphasize what the sheriff said. Where and when the fires merged is obviously an important and valid question, and I imagine it'll be the subject of a lot of civil litigation going forward. But for us, with determining cause and origin and whether there's any criminal charges that should attach, we were not focused on that. So could it be determined someday? perhaps. But again, it was not part of what we were focused on through the course of our investigation.
Carol McKinley with the Denver Gazette. You talked about the fact that the information you shared would play a role in charges in civil litigation against XL. What about against 5325 and that organization? And do you think that would be a personal lawsuit, or would that be a lawsuit that would be filed against the organization?
Good morning, Carol, and thank you for your question. I think what I had said was the information and the expert reports will certainly play a role in civil litigation. I think it could be involving any number of parties, but I would leave that up to the civil litigants and the civil attorneys involved in that process. It's completely separate from what we focused on and what our role and responsibility was.
And a follow-up, what charges were you considering for this, the ones that you did not go forward with? What were you looking at?
So we looked at any possible charges connected to fire. There are a number of charges that we have under criminal law, and I talked earlier about arson, and there's different degrees of arson based on whether it's knowingly or recklessly. And then we looked at the other conduct and statements to see if there was any criminal violations. There was no evidence whatsoever of a criminal violation with regards to the statements by Excel after. And then for the criminal line, for the repair of the line, we looked to see if there was any criminal activity there. We did not determine that there was any evidence to go forward with criminal charges.
So reckless would be that they didn't mean to do it, but it was just it was an accident that happened because they were reckless and they didn't pay attention.
So reckless is defined under criminal law as disregarding a substantial and unjustifiable risk. So the two examples we use in court are often someone fires a gun towards an area where there might be people, or someone's driving 100 miles per hour on the diagonal highway, and there are other cars, pedestrians, cyclists in the area. Those are examples of reckless conduct where they disregard a substantial and unjustified risk. So where that was relevant to us, or where that mattered to us, was with regards to the December 24th fire. Did the residents of that property set the fire disregarding a substantial and unjustifiable risk? There's no indication that they did, given that it was wet, cool, rainy out that day, plus the firefighters came and thought what the residents were doing in terms of having set the fire, but also their plan to extinguish the fire with dirt, was reasonable and responsible in the eyes of the fire department.
Can you confirm whether that December 24th fire included the burning of railroad ties? And if so, does that not fall under treated lumber, which the experts say should never be burned?
There was definitely wood in the fire, and I have to go back, Kevin, and check to see exactly what was described, and it's in our summary report as well.
Did XL have you said you got thousands of documents from them. Did they have a record that that line had been unmoored for some time or previous time?
Previously, no. There was no record of issues involving their equipment or maintenance, and that was something that was very important in our analysis. In other words, this is a different discussion and a different decision if that equipment was worn or shoddy or they had maintenance issues in the past. There was no such record of that, no indication of that. And then we actually, not me and the sheriff personally, but we had the wire taken down with the cooperation of Excel. So they de-energized that whole area, took all the equipment down. We had examined on scene, and then we had it taken to a lab to have it studied up close to determine the arcing that you see there. And that's described in our summary report as well. But no indication that there was any defects with the equipment or the maintenance of that area.
Just to clarify, Michael, that you're saying that line became an award to that stage of the highway and stuff previously?
That's what the investigation determined, and that's what we believe. Yes, Rob?
So that little chunk that's missing in the picture, is that when you say hot particles blew up? Is that what that chunk is showing us, where pieces of the wire just kind of disintegrated?
That is very likely, yes. So the wire swinging, banging against another wire could cause, or did cause, hot particles to be released. And it was the determination that those hot particles were of a size and significance that if they traveled 79.6 feet or 110.5 feet, they would still maintain enough heat to cause that second fire.
Sheriff, one last question. Spent more than an hour explaining. What do you hope the residents of your community take away from the past 17-plus months that you've done and the hour of this presentation?
Well, I think the response from the Marshall Fire impacted community is going to be all over the map. One of the things that I have learned interacting with all of my friends and neighbors who have been devastated by this fire is that we're all in different places with how we process it and how we feel about where we are today. And I think there will be some people that are frustrated that there are no criminal charges. I think there are a significant number of people that I know personally who understand the weather conditions that day, the wind event that day, and have for a long time thought that this was likely how that fire may have started. They may not have fully understood the fire that was burned on December 24th and how that created that first fire. So I anticipate a mix of responses and emotions to what we presented today. And I understand and appreciate that, knowing that some of us are on a path moving forward and others are still struggling to make it to tomorrow.
Thank you.
I was just want a little bit more clarity on this. Fire experts have said that they could smolder for months, and I'm assuming firefighters would know that. So I'm just curious why they would be satisfied with just burying it, the fire at that time without saying you need to put water on it as well.
I think part of that is nobody predicted the wind event that we had 6 days later that could uncover the fire. And I don't disagree with you that on that property was a significant water source that could have been used to put that fire to rest. But I also can't speculate to exactly what the firefighters saw and their interaction with those residents on that day.
Natalie Scully with KUNC. Can you tell me why this investigation took so long? What was necessary in all of those months?
So I'll address part of that, and I'll let Mr. Doherty address part of that. From the sheriff's office perspective, part of it was all the work that had to get done early on post-fire. As I mentioned, initially we had 146 people reported missing in our community, and our priority was trying to locate those humans and make sure they were safe. We also had 2 really difficult death investigations to conduct, which took investigator time. And unfortunately, in Boulder County, crime and all of the other things that we are responsible for didn't stop and give us a break to dedicate full-time resources. And I don't have unlimited investigators to go out and work cases solely. We had multiple homicide investigations last year that our investigators were involved in. We had other complex, challenging cases that we had to work through. And so part of it was workload and bandwidth of our investigators. And part of it was at points during this investigation, as new information was discovered, as new items were revealed, we had to continually go down separate paths to rule in or rule out specific pieces of evidence, where and how the fire started. And I'll let Mr. Doherty also speak about some of the other complexities within this investigation that made it take a little more time.
Thank you for your question. I would say that from the very beginning, our commitment was to conducting an exhaustive investigation, that we would leave no stone unturned. So I would point you to the diagram down here that shows within a 2,000-foot area, we have coal seam vents pushing out hot air. We have an electrical line that's unmoored, and we have a home where a fire has been uncovered and is throwing embers and flames across the property. That's just an extremely complex scene for fire investigators and prosecutors to go through and determine what played what role there. A lot of the information that we required in connection with the electrical line was from Excel. That included a tremendous amount of data, documents, and also witness interviews, as we determined that we wanted to make sure there was nothing at issue about the repair of the line or the communication about whether it was downed or floater. So this wasn't just a purely cause and origin investigation that you might have with a fire where a lightning strikes a tree. This was far more complex than that. We wanted to make sure we got it right. So this was an exhaustive investigation. And in dealing with the property owners there, but also Excel, some of these things took time in terms of getting what we needed and getting the interviews that we needed conducted. So I recognize fire investigations take a long time. This one was actually more than just a pure fire investigation. Like if you look at the East Troublesome fire, for example, I think that took 18 months before they released cause and origin. And just based on what I know, it was nowhere near the complexity in terms of the residents with a fire burning, coal seam vents, and issues with the electrical line becoming unmoored. And then this spin-off investigations that we conducted to make sure there was no criminal conduct whatsoever.
Well, we appreciate you being here today. And I know Michael and I will be sticking around for a little bit. And if you have questions about any of the images that are here today, we'd be happy to talk to you about them. With that, thank you. Have a good day.